All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar discussion on security for the service desk. In a second, I'll hand you over to Ollie O'Donoghue, who's hosting today, and he'll introduce you to our guest. But first of all, let me just remind you to post your questions for the panel, post them using your control panel on the right, and we'll come to those at the end. Okay, thanks. Over to you, Ollie.
Thank you, Zoe. So, thank you everyone for joining us here today. We're going to be talking about security and the service desk and what it means for service desk managers. And I think this is a really important thing to talk about, an important thing to get right. You know, every morning I seem to wake up and see something in the news about security and its implications as far as information is concerned. So to get the ball rolling and to get a bit of an expert opinion, I'd like to welcome Richard Soudan, who's a security manager with CoSocius. So hello, Richard, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ollie. Hi, Zoe. Yeah, thanks for the invite.
That's no problem at all. You know, really good to have you here. So, Richard, can you just tell us where security management sits within your organisation?
Yes, certainly. So, CoSocius is an organisation. We have around 450 staff. We cover areas of ICT service desk and also ICT project management and delivering infrastructure and new services. We also have a range of employee service centres. So we support around 8,000 users across 2 councils, so Cheshire West and Chester, and also Cheshire East Council. And then we also have a number of partner and third-party organisations. That includes private organisations and schools. So for me, there's a dedicated role within CoSocius for information security management. So my role covers 3 areas predominantly. So I set and define the policies that are security-based policies, things like the ICT security policy, the acceptable use policy and standards. I provide advice both internally and externally. So I sort of look after our support staff, I look after our managers, and I can do anything from risk assessments or just giving general good guidance and advice. And then the other thing that sort of is a key area for my role is around compliance. So I need to ensure as an organisation that we meet our compliance requirements. And that's things like the Data Protection Act or PCI compliance. And as we deal with local government, it's also our PSN code connection and our NHS connections as well.
Well, so it's a really, really broad role then, really, you know, and really important for the service desk. So, I mean, do you think it's the job of everyone on the service desk to ensure that the kind of the IT and the information is secure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, we recognise that we're both data controllers, so we collect information and we manage information on people's behalf, but we're also data process as well. So as part of delivering our services out to the councils and the other businesses, we're responsible for looking after our customers' data. So we collect information and occasionally that's sensitive personal information, but we also sort of look after things when we're doing the administration of bits and pieces. So we'd be carrying out administration of things like email. When we manage our desktops and we connect to desktops, there's the potential that staff will be accessing and have visibility of sensitive information. So all our staff have a level of responsibility that's kind of placed on them, and they have to know how to operate and identify potential risks and issues. They're also responsible for ensuring that sort of the correct guidance and advice is provided. So different organisations will have different policies and they expect different controls to be followed. So, you know, an organisation that provides medical services will have different policies to, say, a housing association. So our staff, we don't expect them to be experts, but we have to sort of expect them to have a good understanding of why certain controls are in place and why they're being asked to do things.
Great. Yeah. So I mean, is that responsibility? So I mean, we've mentioned the service desk, and I suspect an awful lot of the people listening to this webinar will be from service desks. So it's an important responsibility for them. But is it, you know, you've mentioned organisation. Is it an organisation-wide responsibility? So, you know, everyone's got their part to play.
Yeah, from the very top, from your senior management who are driving your policy, they need to understand the importance. So when they're looking for new systems and new bits and pieces, they need to understand the risk that's associated with it, right down to kind of the guys that are sort of managing your key fob system and your access to your buildings and all those bits and pieces, your janitors. Everybody has a responsibility for understanding kind of why security is important to their organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're starting to see a bit more of that now, a bit more of that kind of accountability everywhere. So from an ownership point of view, is there someone in your organisation that has ownership of security?
Yeah, and actually this is the same for all organisations. So although I've got a particular role which is around service desk and kind of making sure that there's security management is sort of part and parcel of that, and some of the bigger bits and pieces. The actual ownership for security sort of sits within the chief level of the organisation. So for us, there's a senior information risk owner. So on a day-to-day basis, I'll be reporting risks and issues and other bits and pieces back up through the chain. And that's important because actually under the Data Protection Act and under legislation, if we get fined or something happens, then there has to be somebody at the senior management level that understands what that's about and what's involved and kind of what the implications are for some of the things that they're trying to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the seniority's got to be there to take control. Is that something that then it's their job to cascade that importance back down, right down to the rest of the organisation?
Yeah, and for us, our policy, although I write the policies, they are led by the senior management team. So at the point where we produce a policy, we sit down with the senior management teams and we look at the impact of that policy across the organisation and how it would affect people, potentially how it might affect how they want to work or how they want to operate. Generally, security sits on one or two sides. You kind of have security at one end, which everything's locked down and very secure, versus potentially flexibility at the other end. Everybody wants to work in the way that's kind of natural to them, but sometimes that doesn't always fit within the security control. So I'll sit down with our management team, just talk through the implications, and then discuss how we communicate that out once that's been agreed.
Fantastic. So it's got that high strategic element that has scope of everything. So presumably from your point, so you were a kind of public sector organisation. Now I understand you're sort of at arm's length. You support those public sector organisations. So regulation and legislation has got to have an impact on security management, and presumably some aspects of it are mandatory for service desks.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, sort of the key things that we tend to get involved in, things like PCI compliance, because we support organisations that take card payments and we have to understand our relationship with those organisations and some of the information that we might have access to or how it sits on our network. But because we support local government, then there's also, like I said earlier, the PSN and the NHSM3. But probably the biggest thing that we need to concentrate on is actually the Data Protection Act. This is actually the legislation, this is law, and the requirements are set down in law. So for us, it's the same with any organisation. We need to be clear about what we're processing and what we're collecting. It's actually the ICO, so the Information Commissioner's Office. It's their job to enforce the legislation, and they will always disclose any findings of breaches along with details of the fines that have been imposed. So if you go onto the ICO website, public sector generally gets is in the limelight a bit more with the ICO, but it also includes private organisations as well. And you'll see on their website, they will clearly talk through what they found, how they found it, what were the controls in place, or what was lacking, and actually what was the fine that organisation had on them. And then there's also some changes coming up. So in the EU at the moment, it's just passed and it's gone through kind of the EU, and it's coming into the UK and it's going through at the moment, which is the changes to the Data Protection Act. And there's around 5 fairly big things that are coming in, which will potentially change the Data Protection Act and how we're treating data. So it includes things like, so at the moment, if there's a data breach, an organisation can be fined up to a maximum of £500,000, so £500,000.
Yeah.
Now, for larger organisations with a high turnover, that's considered, it's not enough of a stick to ensure that they enforce that legislation. So going forward, the expectation is that firms can be fined up to 2% of their global turnover. And that would even include charities as well, although for charities that would be capped at €1 million. Other changes that they're looking to enforce, so all businesses that operate in Europe, regardless of their home location, will still be bound by these rules. And there's an expectation that organisations will be called upon to have a dedicated data protection officer. So, and for consumers, the benefit for them is that they will have a new right to data portability. So it means the information you collect on your consumers and your customers, you will have to make it easy for them to transfer that information to other service providers or other services if that's what they want to do. And you have to be clear about what you're collecting information for and what you're going to do with it. So there's a lot more transparency. So there is also potentially talk about that if you do have a data breach, at the moment you're not mandatorily required to disclose that breach. And there's definitely talk. So in the US at the moment, if you have a disclosure, you have to, or if you have a breach, you have to disclose it. It has to be publicly available. So there's talk about that potentially coming in as well.
Wow. Okay. I mean, and as well, 2% of global turnover could be a phenomenal amount for some organisations. So that makes it really important to get it right. It's a hell of an incentive to get security right. So what sort of implications does all this have on the service desk?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for us that we have to look at are those types of issues where there's sort of inadvertent disclosure. Generally speaking, when you look at a lot of the breaches that happen, they are almost like accidental disclosures. Somebody's had a job to do and the job takes priority, but as part of actually carrying out that role and completing that task, they have inadvertently given away information or disclosed information. So you need to look at things like an example that we've had recently with our service desk is that one of the guys, being helpful, he supported an issue but didn't check that some of the right controls had been applied after supporting that issue and fixing it. So it meant for us one of our laptops went back out into the field without encryption on it. Unfortunately for us, that was a laptop that was later stolen, and so we've had some issues then and being challenged about having to understand what the sensitivity of the data was on that device. And fortunately for us, there was nothing actually on it. So those are the kind of things you have to look at. So things like email, do you use email encryption? Do you collect information and then send it off via email? And do you have the appropriate controls and safeguards around it?
Yeah, and I suppose in the news we hear stories all the time, and like you say, sometimes it's often quite an innocent mistake that's taken place, or something that perhaps wasn't even in the forefront of consideration. It's had wide sweeping implications for the organisation, particularly public sector, that, as you pointed out earlier, tend to get the limelight. So I guess that leads me on to the next question, which is should security be at the forefront of the service desk mindset, i.e. above customer service? So I imagine some of our attendees here recognise the importance that customer service has for the service desk, and often it's the first thing we think about. Should security be more important than that, equal to that? Where do you think that should sit?
So I'm possibly a little bit biased as the security manager, but actually when you look at it, no, definitely not. Security should not come above the customer service, because without the customer services, there's no point in having the security. So it's not above the customer experience. Once upon a time, maybe you would say that security should be at the forefront. There's when the government would when they lost those CDs and when there's been sort of data breaches and big disclosures, things like that, then potentially it changes the emphasis a little bit. But at the moment, the kind of mantra that's going around is that the customer experience is everything, but the security needs to be good enough. So the key thing is kind of defining what is good enough for your organisation. So you need to look at what you're delivering. So, if you look at bring your own device, cloud, consumerisation, there's things like big data, the Internet of everything. And that kind of means that our users are far more IT savvy than they've ever been before, and they actually demand how they want to operate. So we need to respond to those changes and make sure that we give the appropriate guidance and advice. The stock answer used to be, for every request that came in, my job was quite easy, because you used to say, no, can't do it, it's going to be a security issue, you can't do what you're wanting to do. But actually that's no longer, I wouldn't be in my job very long now if I said that. So for me now it's about saying, yes, of course you can do that, but if you do it, here are the risks that you need to understand, or that your management team need to understand, or this is what you need to buy into. So you actually put some of that responsibility back with the user, because they understand the type of business that they do and how they want to operate. You just need to make sure you give them the right controls to do it. So the key thing is the IT shouldn't lead the IT agenda. It should fit around the business and not the other way around. But the business kind of needs to understand that it's doing it with the right kind of information to hand, that they've been given the relevant sort of steer and the relevant guidance. Absolutely,
yeah, absolutely. And like you say, this big push. I mean, there's this due to people's experiences with consumer technology. I think it's sort of the idea, if you're not going to make this secure and support me, I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway, which is a much greater risk than perhaps doing the bit of work to make that solution secure. I mean, in my experience as an analyst, as a former analyst, some security measures such as frequently changing passwords can really become a kind of a bit of debate with customers who kind of don't understand why they should need to reset their passwords. So how do you think the service desk articulates the importance of these kind of fairly basic security considerations?
Yeah, so For your organisation, your end users, the people sat at the end of those devices, they are the front line. They're the ones that would normally be looked to be exploited, and they don't necessarily understand some of the controls and safeguards that you're putting in place. If you can get your end users to understand what you're trying to do and not just get them to kind of follow a set policy without understanding it, then it's a win-win, because it supports the business and it supports kind of the calls and things that you deal with. So, and the service desk are crucial for helping to support the message about good IT security. And your service desk staff are actually normally the first ones to hear about any potential issues. So they're the ones that hear first about lost equipment or potential viruses or people sharing their accounts. And so they're the ones that have to kind of preach that good practice. So an example for us is that, probably up until 12 months ago, obviously Windows XP was kind of going end of life. It was in the press. So, and we've had a considerable task, changing Windows XP, which was pushed out through our entire estate, and moving it to a more supported, more up-to-date operating system. Those operating systems, the more modern ones, Windows 7, Windows 8, and looking at Windows 10, they're far better, they're far more secure, and they allow far more versatility with the way our users want to work. The challenge is our users don't always buy into that. They are so used to using the equipment that they've got that you kind of almost have to prize it from the cold dead hands. It's our service desk, like going out and speaking to them and talking through some of the benefits. So not talking about it from a security point of view, but talking about how it benefits them and what they're trying to achieve. Then you actually get your users buying for it.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, something I will just say to our attendees: do keep those questions coming in. We'll try and answer those at the end of the webinar. So do keep asking questions. So I suppose next thing, when considering the part the service desk has to play, are there working partnerships that need to be in place, such as between suppliers or infrastructure teams, to make sure that everyone's kind of has the same priorities and understanding of the security needs?
Yeah, so our support staff will work extremely closely with our infrastructure teams. So we have server teams, we've got network teams, and they all have to work together. So if something fails, if something stops working, then there's the communication channel is open to them. They don't work in isolation. They have to feel that if necessary, they can go to those relevant areas. So something as simple for us as, say, your security patches that get pushed out. So our service desk guys all have to understand or have to have visibility of when our patching cycles are. So for us, we patch the entire estate over probably the period of a month. So we do those low risk, low sort of low availability systems to start with. We push out internal to our IT staff so they can see what the patches do, make sure there's no challenges or implications, and then we slowly work through the rest of the estate, the more critical and the high-end stuff. So it's our infrastructure teams that kind of set that agenda, and it's our service desk staff that have to kind of understand the timescales and things. There's nothing worse than a patch causing an issue and then we don't react quickly enough to fix it, because that means we lose confidence then in that process, and our end users are the ones that kind of become a bit more against that kind of process and that kind of thing happening. If you keep everybody on side, it just makes it an awful lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, with software as a service becoming more prevalent, do you think the service desk has a part to play to ensure that these applications meet the security needs of the organisations? There are quite a few pieces of software that service desks use now and organisations use that follow the software as a service model. What do you think kind of the service desk should do to make sure that kind of meets requirements?
Yeah, so the interesting thing with sort of some of the new sort of technology and how organisations want to operate is there's a clamour to kind of move everything into the cloud, provide it as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platform as a service. And we've done it ourselves. We've looked at a hosted solution for kind of our service desk calls and our calls that come in. So for me, the key thing is understand what information you collect and understand how it's used. So you have to understand does that information involve any personal information? Is it sensitive personal information? Do you have to comply with the Data Protection Act then? So there's some key things you have to do that you can't get away from with cloud-based services. So although it makes it a lot easier because stuff becomes more accessible and more available, there's some considerations around things like where will that data physically be hosted. So, the Data Protection Act says you're not allowed to store that data outside the European Economic Union, or if it's an American organisation, they have to follow the Safe Harbour Agreement. If not, you're expected take responsibility for carrying out those checks and balances on where that data is stored to make sure it's being stored effectively and stored safely and is appropriately secured. So there's also some other subtle risks that are introduced with software as a service. So if that service becomes available over the internet, do you allow your service desk staff then to have access to that from a home PC, from a potentially unmanaged device? And the difference here just slightly is that if that home PC has maybe been compromised and that the username and passwords are being collected off that PC, if it's used by, the kids during the day and then you go home and you work on it, if there's anything like malware on that device that's collecting and harvesting that information and the web addresses that you're accessing, then have you suddenly allowed access to your service desk tool to somebody that you don't know about, and how do you kind of manage and maintain that? So there's some new subtleties that are introduced with cloud, and that's one of the things that we have to do, is understand what our role is in kind of supporting those services securely.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot more, because I hadn't actually considered kind of the role software as a service and cloud-based stuff plays when you go home, and like you say, it massively opens the net of security to all of these other devices that the service desk and indeed IT don't really have any contact with. So I'm going to steer it back towards the service desk now. So realistically, the service desk is the entrance to the whole IT organisation, and customers, well, they should value their interactions with the service desk, which providing kind of a customer experience that makes them really value their contact. So should this position be leveraged to encourage customers to take a more proactive approach to security?
Yeah, totally. Because our service desk staff are the guys that engage directly with the kind of our end users, they're in a key position to be able to kind of pass on some of these messages and kind of ensure things are being done the right way. So we do definitely encourage our service desk staff to actively engage with the users that they support. And we've got a couple of examples of this. So we hold workshops out at the actual offices of the physical locations that we support, and we do things like IT health checks. So, and the nice thing with that is it works for everybody, so it helps personalise the service that you're offering. It's nice when our end users can actually identify with staff that they wouldn't normally get to speak to unless it's over the phone or kind of hidden behind the end of a computer. So, and it actually opens up some of the conversation pieces as well. So you're not just talking about your office-based PCs, but sometimes our users will be talking about their home equipment, and they'll be getting guidance and advice on what they should be doing at home. And our service staff they love engaging in that way as well. So, and the nice thing for me is if staff follow good practice at home, then they will bring that good practice into the office as well. So for me, it's not primarily about making sure the office is secure, it's about making sure that those users actually have good practice, and we use our service desk staff to try and enforce that good sort of cyber security. So the nice thing is as well as the staff out in the field, they can also feed back any issues that they see. So one of the nice things with kind of how we deliver security now is that if something's not working, then we actually review it. We look at why it's not working, and we look at what we were trying to achieve from it, and we actually take a fairly pragmatic approach. So, talk about passwords that need to be changed every 30 days. We might have certain sort of parts of our user estate that actually for them, we're more comfortable with them changing it every 60 days as long as the password is strong enough. So, and for us overall, that'll do things like lower the amount of calls that we have in. It lowers the risk of a breach, and it helps increase the level of trust that there is with staff, and it opens those communication channels when something's not working.
Yeah, like I say, it does turn into kind of quite a positive thing, doesn't it? So if, for example, customers are a bit switched off about security, and you're going out and engaging them about the implications it has in their personal lives, and how they can avoid, junk mail and malware on their own computers, then it kind of places it in a context that people can understand. And also it's very positive, so it's outside of the remit of the service desk in a very positive way. So how do you think you get service desk analysts to buy into the importance of security? So we've recognised that they're in actually a prime position to be able to talk to customers. How do you get the actual analysts to buy in and talk to the customers about security and the importance it has?
Yes, so our security staff if done right, security is an enabler. It drives the efficiencies. So things like an example would be our service desk were fielding an awful lot of calls every morning. They were coming in. People had been on holiday. They were coming back after the weekend, and they'd forgotten the passwords. So a considerable amount of time was spent by our service desk staff actually supporting those users, resetting the passwords and all the other controls and things that go along with it, and that was taking up time. So So we actually looked, and for some of our systems, we've enabled password self-service. So, and it actually puts the control back with those end users. So what they do is they set up some security questions for themselves. They've forgotten their password. They can actually answer the security questions that they've set up, and that removes, all that time that our guys were spending on the telephone trying to support issues with them. Those issues have gone away, and our service desk staff can then be getting on with other bits and pieces and kind of being used more effectively and more efficiently. The other thing is as well that if you've got your service desk staff engaged, when you do have incidents, you should promote sort of an openness. So if things do happen, so if there is a potential breach or an incident or somebody's done something accidental, then it's important to make sure that they feel that they can report that openly and honestly without us necessarily kind of, without the threat necessarily of something bad happening as a result of it. Because otherwise, all that does is it means people will keep issues for themselves and it doesn't get reported. And actually, I'd much rather have an open and honest kind of discussion with people and about how to fix things and make it right, rather than accuse somebody because they've done something wrong in the first instance. And that can be, you look at your service desk, you look at the figures, you look at the calls that are coming in, and you look at kind of the reports that you get back, and you can actually see that we're getting sort of traction and value there.
Yeah, and I suppose if you create an environment where security issues can be kind of talked about openly, as you say, then you can usually resolve them before anything serious happens. If people are hiding them away, then they can get an awful lot worse.
And interestingly, it's sort of social engineering. So what they've recognised now is that sometimes trying to attack the IT system and trying to attack the infrastructure is actually a bit more difficult than actually attacking, kind of trying to get the information divulged through a social engineering type of attack. So I think it was a couple of years ago, there was a report done by RSA along with the SANS Institute, and they said that actually one of the biggest weaknesses that it's really easy to try and get information out of help sort of service desk staff workers, and they are very easy victims for social engineering attacks. So an example might be if you're on the service desk and you're answering a call and you believe that the chief exec is calling you and they want their password reset there and then how do you know that call is a legitimate call from somebody who needs to have that information versus somebody who's just trying to get that engineered and use it then to attack your systems? So the service desk can be a gateway into the organisations that we support, and we have to be very aware of that and very diligent about sort of those types of issues.
Great. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I have seen some service desks that do struggle to weigh up kind of the example you've used almost exactly actually, where they've got that VIP support, that pressure to get their CEO back working. But they've also got that security concern. But often the VIP wins and they reset the password.
Totally.
Actually, that's the account really that needs to be protected the most, because of the amount of information it contains. So it is an interesting conflict. We've got a question from one of the attendees. So I've got a question from Kimberly here, and it's along the password resets line. So it's, how do you deal with your password reset requests? Do you ask additional security questions? So I think actually I was at an event fairly recently where the password reset question came up a bit, and I did kind of say that if somebody knows how to fix that, then they're probably going to be very popular. I don't think anyone could. So how did you deal with the password reset? Hello, Richard. Can you?
Oh, you still there?
Yeah, sorry. I think we've
can.
had some connection issues at the moment. Can everyone hear me okay now?
Yeah, you're back. I've got you.
Yeah, great. Sorry, yeah, I think we had a bit of a connection issue there. So, sorry, my question from Kimberly was, how do you resolve kind of password reset issues? Do you ask additional security questions? So it's a big one, the password question. It stumps a lot of service desks. So how do you handle it over at CoSocius?
Yeah, so what you look for, there's additional questions that you can ask. So you can decide that if you want to, you can collect some additional information. So for us, we would potentially look at things like the employee record and the stuff that the employee should know that's unique to themselves over and above just having the password. But actually the other thing as well is our service desk staff are kind of, they know the types of situations that those people would be expecting that call to come in. So an example we had was that somebody called asking for a encryption password reset on a device, and the conversation just didn't flow the way you would expect your normal conversations to flow. And some of the questions we were asking around things like, can you say, just let us know where you're working from, or what's your office that you're normally based at? They weren't able to answer those questions sufficiently. So at that point, it was escalated, and the call came through to me, and I had a look at it. And actually, in this instance, it was a laptop that had been lost previously and picked up maliciously, and somebody was trying to get access to the hard drive. So you don't necessarily have to ask hard and fast questions, but what you do have to do is ensure that your service desk staff are vigilant, that type of thing. And if they believe something's going on that's not quite right, then they report it. So normally what you'd expect as part of your security is that if you can't prevent it, you can at least detect something that's going on. You can have a look at your logs there, you can have a look at some of the other systems, and you can have a few conversations with people. And if necessary, your management team can actually have a conversation with the chief exec or the secretary or whoever it might be, and actually get some validation of what's going on. They would much rather appreciate that you're working in a secure way than find their accounts being compromised at a later date.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this an interesting one. So do you have kind of an easy to follow process for analysts to be able to, because that's a great example of detection, really, just by asking those kind of really authentic and personalised questions. Is that a process that's easy to follow for your analysts?
Yeah, absolutely. And our service desk tool kind of supports that as well. So you can ask even something fairly like basic. So I see you called us last week regarding an issue that you had. Can you just talk me through what that was? Yeah. And if you've had that conversation with that person, then you know that, or if that call has taken place, then that person should know what the issue was.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of dealing with it, as opposed to kind of the date of birth type questions that you could usually Google that, actually, what with social media and everything. A lot of that information is available if you want to. So that's interesting. I've never seen that done. That's a really interesting way of doing it, of kind of engaging the individual through authenticity, through kind of those questions. That's interesting. Is there any kind of call coaching that you do surrounding that? Is that something that analysts have to be trained on, or is it the systems that support them in doing it?
So it's fairly easy to use the systems to support that, but what I would do is I would work with Mandy, who's one of the service desk managers, and Keith, and I'll sit down with them and we'll talk through the types of issues that we're seeing. And we've looked, so this is something that we've always had an issue with. So in the past we were looking at things like, well, should we record things like, maiden names, or, should we get things like date of birth?
Yeah.
For me, the challenge with that is that you're actually recording fairly sensitive information, and that places extra pressure on us to look after that information securely. And plus, if it was me, I wouldn't necessarily be divulging that information to a third party just for something like a password reset. So it's looking at other things that you collect that only that individual would know the answer to, and then base your call around that type of stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That is really interesting. So we've got another question from Robert, which is, what do you believe is the biggest security risk IT organisations have to deal with at the moment? So it's probably hard just to pin down one.
Yeah, I'm a security.
Sorry?
Yeah, so I would say probably as a security manager, I'm paranoid. So absolutely everything's a risk.
Yeah, I know.
The two main areas, Ruth. The two main areas are, you have to look at the risk from the inside of your organisation. So whether it's inadvertent or malicious, you have to try and understand kind of what things that are being done internally that could allow for a potential incident or a potential breach. An example might be you've got a member of staff who's leaving in a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden they start sending themselves all their key documentation and all their bits and pieces to take to another organisation with them. So there's potential level of confidentiality with that information. There might be some intellectual property associated with it. So it's, have you got the appropriate controls in place to prevent it? If you can't prevent it, can you detect it, and can you contain it? So there's the internal one. There's also the external issues. So and this is around the value of information. So people are very aware of the value of information, and this is kind of, that it's almost like the hacking and the malware has been commoditized as well.
Yeah.
So malware kits, so if you want to attack an organization, there are actually services that will do that for you that you can get over the internet. There are programs that you can buy, and it's interesting because for your money you will get a fully supported project. You might even have a service desk telephone number if you can't get it to work properly that you can phone up and use. And These things are coming down in price as well. So You don't have to pay thousands upon thousands for them. And what they normally rely on is that your organisation is not patched, it's not up to date, and you've not got the latest security fixes. So they might exploit something that might be 12 months old, but for them, as long as it works, that's the key thing. So I know the government did an estimate on cybercrime, I think it was last year, and they actually put the cost of cybercrime within organisations at £27 billion per annum. So, and they were saying things like, identity theft costs nearly £2 billion and online fraud £1.4 billion.
Wow, I mean, it's actually a phenomenal amount of money, isn't it, to put a figure to? So, I mean, we've got another question. So, what if an organisation doesn't have a security manager in place? Obviously, you really know this area in and out. But what about perhaps smaller organisations or organisations that aren't as mature as CoSocius? What if they don't have a security manager in place? What would you recommend?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a full-time role. But what I would say is that it's relevant to ensure that you have somebody that takes the responsibility for the security. So, and that somebody can just have an awareness of it. There's an awful lot of information out there now. The government's launched initiatives, things like Cyber Streetwise, which designed it for organisations and small businesses around what they can do to be more proactive around security and what kind of good security hygiene.
Right. Okay. So it is possible to kind of. I mean, I don't like to say this, but perhaps something that a security manager, I'm saying, a service desk manager could do initially, but then they do have a massive range of job roles to fulfil, so it might not be a popular suggestion, but the support is out there. So I think we've got one final question just to wrap up on. So, in your opinion, what are the three key areas service desks should go away and look at after this webinar? So something that they can just go away and do as soon as we finish.
Yeah. So the first thing is understand the data that you collect and assign a value to it. Make sure you know what your information is that you're using and what you're using it for. I would say understand your client's business and the value of their data and what they're trying to do with their information, and then just carry out good cyber skills. So there are standards out there, things like ISO 27001. For me, there's 113 controls. It's fairly in depth. But if you don't want to do that, there are actually other things out there. So you can test your network security and look at things like the Cyber Essentials scheme. Now, this is a scheme that's been brought in with small and large companies in mind, and it's about looking at what you do, looking at your processes, and then you get an assessment against that.
Wow.
The nice thing is with that, once you've got that assessment, you can use that as your brand. So, the government, for example, and the UK central government, they would insist on that standard before they would do business with IT organisations.
Right. Okay. So it's quite a powerful thing to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's not that onerous either. It's fairly standard and basic processes and principles.
Right, yeah, and I think you very kindly actually provided us with a link to that site. So that's something that we'll be sending out afterwards, so people can take a look at it. It does look like it'll be well worth taking the time to do. Well, I think that's all the questions that I have for you, and all the questions that our attendees have. So it's been a genuine pleasure speaking to you, Richard, and thank you very much for giving us your expert advice.
No problem. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, and yeah, thank you everyone who posted questions, and thanks a lot.